On the coldest morning of the year, a reclusive millionaire finds a dirty and shocked girl inside the doghouse of his mansion. Without documents, without a clear memory, she carries deep traumas and survival habits that reveal a cruel past. When he takes her in, his meticulously controlled life falls apart. Employees abandon him, the media persecutes him, and justice knocks on the door. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. The frost-laden air bit through Maxwell Harrison's expensive wool coat as he stepped out of his heated garage into the bitter January morning. At 62, he had grown accustomed to his solitary morning inspections of the vast grounds surrounding his Connecticut estate, but something felt different today. The persistent barking of his two prized English bulldogs throughout the night had disrupted his carefully maintained routine, and now an unsettling silence blanketed the property. Maxwell's life ran like the precise mechanical workings of a Swiss watch. Every morning at exactly 6:30, he would conduct his property check before retreating to his home office, where he would spend hours managing his ever-growing real estate empire. The inheritance from his father had been substantial, but through ruthless business acumen and an almost obsessive attention to detail, Maxwell had transformed it into a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. His footsteps crunched on the frozen grass as he made his way toward the custom-built doghouse, an elaborate structure that had cost more than some people's homes. Winston and Churchill, his bulldogs, had been acting strangely for the past few days, refusing to enter their usual sleeping quarters despite the dropping temperatures. As he approached, the morning mist parted, revealing something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, curled up in the corner of the doghouse, was a small figure wrapped in what appeared to be old blankets. Maxwell's first instinct was to call security, but something held him back. As he crouched down to look closer, a pair of dark eyes met his, eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world in their depths. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, stared back at him without making a sound. Her clothes were dirty and worn, her face smudged with dirt, and her small body trembled from the cold. Yet she didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched him with an unsettling stillness that made his chest tighten inexplicably. Beside her lay a small backpack, its fabric worn and faded, with a hand-stitched cloth toy poking out from the top. When Maxwell reached out his hand, more out of instinct than conscious thought, she flinched almost imperceptibly but remained silent. Something about her reaction stirred a long-buried memory within him, a flash of another child, decades ago, flinching from an outstretched hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he found himself saying, his voice hoarse from disuse. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He rarely spoke to anyone outside of business meetings these days. The girl's only response was to pull her knees closer to her chest, her eyes never leaving his face. The rational part of Maxwell's brain, the part that had built his empire through cold, calculated decisions, told him to call the authorities immediately. This was a liability, a potential scandal, a disruption to the carefully ordered world he had built around himself. But for the first time in decades, that voice wasn't the loudest in his head. Martha, his housekeeper of 15 years, was already in the kitchen when he led the silent child through the back door. The elderly woman's eyes widened at the sight, but years of professional discretion kept her from commenting. Without a word, she began preparing hot chocolate and gathering clean towels, while Maxwell stood awkwardly in his own kitchen, watching as the girl surveyed her surroundings with the careful attention of someone much older. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then her lips parted slightly. "Emma," she whispered, the sound barely audible in the vast kitchen. As Martha set a steaming mug of hot chocolate in front of her, Emma's hands remained firmly in her lap. She stared at the drink as if it might be a trap, and Maxwell noticed how she had positioned herself with a clear view of both exits. The behavior sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. What Maxwell didn't know, as he watched the strange child in his kitchen that morning, was that his precisely ordered world was about to unravel. The numbers and contracts that had defined his existence for so long would soon seem meaningless in the face of the mystery that had taken shelter in his dog's house. And the carefully buried past he had spent a lifetime running from was about to catch up with him in ways he could never have anticipated. The first few days with Emma in the mansion were like navigating through a minefield. Every sudden movement, every loud noise, every well-intentioned gesture seemed to trigger an invisible alarm within her. Maxwell watched as she meticulously counted out Cheerios at breakfast, storing some in her pockets when she thought no one was looking. She would sit for hours in corners, her back always to the wall, dark eyes, tracking every movement in the room like a tiny sentinel. The first night, Maxwell had Martha prepare one of the guest rooms, a beautiful space with a canopy bed and hand-painted clouds on the ceiling. But when they went to check on Emma in the morning, they found the bed untouched. Instead, she had created a nest of blankets in the closet, the door closed just enough to leave a crack for watching. The sight made Maxwell's hands shake as he poured his morning coffee. It was on the fourth day that the first note arrived. Maxwell found it slipped under his front door during his morning routine, a piece of paper folded precisely in thirds, the typing neat and impersonal. Some doors should stay closed. Send her back where she belongs. He crumpled it in his fist, but the words seemed to burn themselves into his mind. That same afternoon, his head of security, James Thompson, resigned without notice after 15 years of service. When pressed for a reason, the man would only say, "Some things aren't worth the risk, Mr. Harrison." Before leaving, he paused at the door and added in a lower voice, "Be careful who you trust with this one, sir." The warning left Maxwell unsettled, but it was nothing compared to what happened that evening. He was in his study, reviewing property documents that suddenly seemed meaningless when he heard it, a scream that made his blood run cold. He found Emma in the kitchen, pressed against the wall, her small body trembling violently. Martha stood, frozen by the sink, where she had dropped a pot that had clattered to the floor. I'm sorry, I'll be quiet, I promise I'll be quiet," Emma was whispering repeatedly, her words running together in a desperate litany. Her eyes were unfocused, seeing something far beyond the kitchen walls. When Maxwell approached, she slid down the wall and curled into a tight ball, protecting her head with her arms. The gesture unlocked something in Maxwell's memory. A small boy doing the same thing decades ago, as heavy footsteps approached his hiding place under the stairs. The flashback hit him with such force that he had to steady himself against the counter. "Emma," he said softly, kneeling at a distance, "you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you for making noise. No one is going to hurt you at all." It took almost an hour for her breathing to steady, for her arms to slowly lower. When she finally looked at him, there was something different in her gaze. A question, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope quickly extinguished. That night, Maxwell couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, feeling more lost than he had in years. The girl's reaction in the kitchen hadn't been normal fear. It had been the response of someone trained to expect punishment for the smallest infractions. The way she stored food, the strategic positioning, the hypervigilance, each detail painted a picture that made him feel physically ill. He tried to do some discreet research online. Missing children reports in the area turned up nothing matching Emma's description. The local police database showed no recent Amber Alerts that fit. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air in his doghouse that cold morning. A second note appeared the next day, this time on his car windshield. "She doesn't belong in your world. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The paper was the same, the font identical, but this time there was a small mark in the corner, a circle with a line through it. Maxwell hired a private investigator, paying extra for discretion. The man came back 3 days later with disturbing information. Witnesses had reported seeing a girl matching Emma's description in Central Park several months ago, always accompanied by a woman who claimed to be her aunt. The woman and child had been noticed because of their odd behavior. The girl never played with other children, never spoke, and the woman's grip on her arm had seemed unnecessarily tight. Then one day they simply stopped appearing. As Maxwell processed this information, Emma slowly began to establish patterns in the house. She would only eat if she saw someone else take a bite first. She created hidden caches of supplies, food, blankets, small objects that could be used as tools in various corners of the house. At night, she would systematically check all the windows and doors, her small hands testing each lock with methodical precision. The behavior was heartbreaking to watch, but what truly haunted Maxwell were the moments when she thought no one was looking. In these unguarded instances, her face would take on an expression of such profound weariness that it seemed impossible on one so young. It was during one of these moments, as he watched her from his study doorway, that Maxwell made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would protect this child no matter the cost. What he didn't realize was that his decision had set in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront not only Emma's demons, but his own carefully buried past. The carefully constructed walls of his isolated existence were about to crumble, and the fall would be far more devastating than he could imagine. As February drew to a close, the first signs of Maxwell's carefully constructed world beginning to unravel appeared in the form of missed meetings and declined calls. His assistant, Rebecca, who had worked with him for over a decade, noticed the change first. The man who once demanded hourly updates now waved away urgent business matters with distracted gestures. Property agreements sat unsigned on his desk while he spent hours researching child psychology and trauma responses. The whispers started in the prestigious neighborhood where his mansion stood apart from the others. Rumors spread about the mysterious child seen through windows and behind curtains. The weekly bridge club that met next door began to speculate about why Harrison's housekeeping staff had suddenly quit one by one, leaving only Martha, who refused to discuss the situation with anyone. One particularly cold morning, Maxwell found Emma in his study, standing perfectly still in front of the large portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. She stared at it with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air as if connecting invisible dots. "Did he leave you too?" she asked suddenly, her voice so unexpected that Maxwell nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since arriving, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "How did you?" he started, but couldn't finish the question. The pain of that long-ago abandonment at the bus station, his father's promise to return, the hours that turned into days of waiting, rose up in his throat like bile. Emma turned to look at him, her eyes holding that unsettling wisdom that made her seem ancient. "They all say they'll come back," she said simply, then returned to her usual corner, leaving Maxwell shaken to his core. That afternoon, the third note arrived, this time delivered with his mail. "You can't save her without destroying yourself. Last warning." The threat was accompanied by a newspaper clipping about a recent investigation into child trafficking rings in the Northeast. Maxwell's hands trembled as he locked the note away with the others in his desk drawer. The following week brought a series of increasingly disturbing incidents. First, Maxwell's most important client, a development company he'd worked with for 20 years, suddenly pulled all their contracts. The CEO's only explanation was a cryptic comment about avoiding potential complications. Then his bank called about suspicious activities in his accounts, large withdrawals he hadn't authorized, transfers to unknown recipients. But it was Emma's nightmares that truly began to break him. They started subtly, small whimpers in the night that grew into heart-wrenching screams. Maxwell would find her thrashing in her closet nest, fighting invisible hands, begging someone to, please, not the dark room again. Each time, it took longer to bring her back to reality, to convince her she was safe. During one particularly bad episode, she clung to his sleeve with surprising strength. "They made me count," she whispered, her voice raw. "Count steps, count doors, count minutes. If I counted wrong, they—" She stopped, her whole body shuddering, and Maxwell felt something inside him crack. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself pulling out old photo albums he hadn't looked at in decades. There he was at 8 years old, standing alone at that bus station, wearing his best clothes because his father had promised they were going somewhere special. Page after page showed the progression of a child becoming harder, colder, more focused on success and control as the years passed. The parallel between his own transformation and Emma's carefully counted Cheerios suddenly seemed unbearable. Martha found him the next morning, still in his study, surrounded by old photographs. She took one look at his face and said, "You're going to fight for her, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. "They'll try to stop me," he replied, thinking of the notes, the contract cancellations, the mysterious bank activities. Martha's weathered face showed no surprise. "Of course they will. People like that always do. The question is, are you ready to lose everything you've built to save one child?" Before he could answer, a crash from upstairs sent them both running. They found Emma in the master bathroom, surrounded by broken glass from a fallen mirror. But it wasn't the glass that made Maxwell's heart stop. It was the symbol she had drawn on the steamy remnants of the mirror, a circle with a line through it, identical to the mark on the second threatening note. As Emma's eyes met his in the mirror's remaining fragments, Maxwell saw something he had never expected: recognition. She knew that symbol. She had seen it before, and whatever it meant had her shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. The discovery should have made him back. A way should have convinced him to call the authorities and wash his hands of the whole situation. Instead, he found himself gathering the trembling child in his arms, careful of the glass, wondering how much more darkness would have to be faced before either of them could find light again. As February drew to a close, the first signs of Maxwell's carefully constructed world beginning to unravel appeared in the form of missed meetings and declined calls. His assistant, Rebecca, who had worked with him for over a decade, noticed the change first. The man who once demanded hourly updates now waved away urgent business matters with distracted gestures. Property agreements sat unsigned on his desk, while he spent hours researching child psychology and trauma responses. The whispers started in the prestigious neighborhood, where his mansion stood apart from the others. Rumors spread about the mysterious child seen through windows and behind curtains. The weekly bridge club that met next door began to speculate about why Harrison's housekeeping staff had suddenly quit one by one, leaving only Martha, who refused to discuss the situation with anyone. One particularly cold morning, Maxwell found Emma in his study, standing perfectly still in front of the large portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. She stared at it with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air as if connecting invisible dots. "Did he leave you too?" she asked suddenly, her voice so unexpected that Maxwell nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since arriving, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "How did you?" he started, but couldn't finish the question. The pain of that long-ago abandonment at the bus station, his father's promise to return, the hours that turned into days of waiting, rose up in his throat like bile. Emma turned to look at him, her eyes holding that unsettling wisdom that made her seem ancient. "They all say they'll come back," she said simply, then returned to her usual corner, leaving Maxwell shaken to his core. That afternoon, the third note arrived, this time delivered with his mail. "You can't save her without destroying yourself. Last warning." The threat was accompanied by a newspaper clipping about a recent investigation into child trafficking rings in the Northeast. Maxwell's hands trembled as he locked the note away with the others in his desk drawer. The following week brought a series of increasingly disturbing incidents. First, Maxwell's most important client, a development company he'd worked with for 20 years, suddenly pulled all their contracts. The CEO's only explanation was a cryptic comment about avoiding potential complications. Then his bank called about suspicious activities in his accounts, large withdrawals he hadn't authorized, transfers to unknown recipients. But it was Emma's nightmares that truly began to break him. They started subtly, small whimpers in the night that grew into heart-wrenching screams. Maxwell would find her thrashing in her closet nest, fighting invisible hands, begging someone to, "Please, not the dark room again." Each time it took longer to bring her back to reality, to convince her she was safe. During one particularly bad episode, she clung to his sleeve with surprising strength. "They made me count," she whispered, her voice raw. "Count steps, count doors, count minutes." If I counted wrong, She stopped, her whole body shuddering, and Maxwell felt something inside him crack. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself pulling out old photo albums he hadn't looked at in decades. There he was at 8 years old, standing alone at that bus station, wearing his best clothes because his father had promised they were going somewhere special. Page after page showed the progression of a child becoming harder, colder, more focused on success and control as the years passed. The parallel between his own transformation and Emma's carefully counted Cheerios suddenly seemed unbearable. Martha found him the next morning, still in his study, surrounded by old photographs. She took one look at his face and said, "You're going to fight for her, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. "They'll try to stop me," he replied, thinking. Of the notes, the contract cancellations, the mysterious bank activities, Martha's weathered face showed no surprise. Of course they will. People like that always do. The question is, are you ready to lose everything you've built to save one child? Before he could answer, a crash from upstairs sent them both running. They found Emma in the master bathroom, surrounded by broken glass from a fallen mirror. But it wasn't the glass that made Maxwell's heart stop. It was the symbol she had drawn on the steamy remnants of the mirror, a circle with a line through it, identical to the mark on the second threatening note. As Emma's eyes met his in the mirror's remaining fragments, Maxwell saw something he had never expected: recognition. She knew that symbol. She had seen it before, and whatever it meant had her shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. The discovery should have made him back away, should have convinced him to call the authorities and wash his hands of the whole situation. Instead, he found himself gathering the trembling child in his arms, careful of the glass, wondering how much more darkness would have to be faced before either of them could find light again. The changes came swiftly after the social worker's visit. Maxwell's most reliable property manager quit without notice, citing personal reasons that sounded rehearsed. 3 major deals fell through in a single week. The local paper ran another article, this time questioning his mental stability and suggesting that the stress of managing his empire had finally broken him. But it was the smaller changes that truly marked the shifting of his world. Emma began speaking more, though her words often raised more questions than they answered. She would stop in the middle of a sentence, looking around as if she'd said too much, then retreat into silence for hours. The counting continued, but now she would sometimes explain fragments of its purpose. 7 steps to the window, she whispered one evening, as Maxwell watched her nightly routine. Count 7 times. If you count wrong, they know. When he asked who they were, she pressed her lips together and began her counting again from the beginning. Dr. Catherine Walsh, the child psychologist appointed by the state, began daily sessions with Emma in the sunroom. Maxwell had chosen this particular room for their meetings because it had the most natural light and 2 clear exits. Details: he'd noticed Emma checking within seconds of entering any space. Dr. Walsh was patient, never pushing too hard, letting Emma set the pace of their interactions. "She's been conditioned," Dr. Walsh explained to Maxwell after their 3rd session, her face grave. "The counting, the strategic awareness, the food hoarding, these aren't random trauma responses. Someone took the time to instill these specific behaviors. The question is why?" That why haunted Maxwell's dreams, mixing with his own childhood memories until he could no longer tell which nightmares were his and which belonged to Emma. He would wake in the early hours, his father's voice echoing in his ears. "Wait here, son, I'll be back in an hour." Those words now tangled with Emma's repeated phrases about counting and green doors. Martha became their anchor in the storm. She adapted to Emma's needs with quiet efficiency, learning to announce her presence before entering a room, placing food where Emma could see it being prepared, keeping the house's routine as predictable as possible. But even Martha couldn't prevent the incident that occurred during the 4th week of Dr. Walsh's sessions. It started with a delivery, a simple package left on the front step. Martha brought it in during breakfast, not noticing Emma's sudden stillness at the sight of the brown paper wrapping. When Maxwell opened it later in his study, he found a child's dress, aged and worn, with that same circle and line symbol embroidered on the collar. Emma's scream brought him running to the sunroom. She stood pressed against the window, pointing at his hands. "The counting dress," she gasped between sobs. "They made us wear it when we counted wrong. Don't let them make me wear it again." Dr. Walsh, who had been present for her session, tried to calm her, but Emma was beyond reaching. She began reciting numbers in a frantic pattern. 1, 4, 7, 12, 16, 23, over and over, her voice rising with each repetition. "Emma," Dr. Walsh said firmly but gently, "you're safe here. Can you tell me about the dress? Who made you wear it?" Emma's counting stopped abruptly. She turned to look at them with eyes that seemed to see through time. "The lady with the quiet shoes," she whispered. "She smiled when she made us count, smiled when we got it wrong." Her voice dropped even lower. "But the man with the ring, he never smiled. He just watched and wrote in his book." Maxwell felt the room tilt slightly. A man with a ring and a notebook. The memory surfaced of his father's heavy signet ring tapping against a leather-bound notebook as he evaluated properties, calculating their worth with cold precision. But that was impossible. His father had disappeared decades ago. Dr. Walsh was still trying to get Emma to elaborate, but the girl had retreated into herself, mechanically folding and unfolding her hands exactly 7 times. Maxwell watched the motion, remembering how his father would fold his handkerchief the same way before putting it in his breast pocket. That evening, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in her closet nest, Maxwell found himself pulling out old family photos again. He studied his father's face in the last picture they'd taken together, the day before the bus station. Something about the confident smile, the carefully pressed suit, the way he held himself. It reminded him of someone, but he couldn't place who. As he put the album away, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ask yourself why she found your house of all places. Nothing is random." The implication sent ice through his veins. Could Emma's appearance in his doghouse have been planned? Was someone using this child to send him a message? Or was there something even darker at play, something that connected his past with Emma's present? Martha found him still in his study at dawn, the morning light revealing the toll of his sleepless night. She took one look at his face and said, "You've figured something out, haven't you?" "Not figured out," Maxwell replied, his voice rough. "Just starting to see the edges of something I should have noticed weeks ago. Martha, I need you to tell me again exactly what time did you first hear the dogs barking that night Emma appeared?" Martha's answer would open another door in their growing maze of questions, one that would lead them closer to understanding why a traumatized child had sought refuge in the home of a man who had spent his life running from his own past. Martha's revelation about the dogs that morning shook Maxwell to his core. "The barking started at exactly 3:47 a.m., she had said, consulting her phone's notes. "I remember checking the time because it was so unusual for them to make such a fuss." The significance of that specific time made Maxwell's hands tremble. 3:47 was the exact time shown on the bus station clock in his last childhood photo with his father. As March brought the first hints of spring to Connecticut, Maxwell's business empire continued to crumble. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, expressing grave concerns about his recent behavior and decision-making. His appearance had changed. The immaculate suits now hung loosely on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes from countless sleepless nights. But while his professional life deteriorated, something else was slowly building in its place. Emma began leaving her drawings where he could find them, not the frightening ones of the windowless room, but new ones. They showed simple things: Winston and Churchill playing in the yard, Martha baking in the kitchen, Maxwell sitting in his study. In each drawing, the figures had small, tentative smiles. During one of Dr. Walsh's sessions, Emma revealed another piece of the puzzle. She had been working with clay, something the therapist had introduced to help her express herself without words. As her small hands shaped the material, she spoke in that distant voice that always signaled a difficult memory. "The lady with quiet shoes had a special watch," she said, her fingers smoothing the clay with precise movements. "It made music at counting time. Like your box." Maxwell, who had taken to sitting in on some sessions with Dr. Walsh's permission, felt his breath catch. "My box?" "The one you hide in the room upstairs," Emma continued, her focus never leaving the clay. "With the dancing lady inside. It plays the counting song." Dr. Walsh watched this exchange with keen interest. "Maxwell," she said carefully, "what is Emma talking about?" His mouth had gone dry. "A music box my father gave me, but I haven't wound it in decades. It's locked away in storage. Emma couldn't have heard it." But Emma was humming now, the same melody that had haunted his childhood nights. The clay in her hands had taken the shape of a small box, and her fingers were etching a familiar pattern into its surface. Maxwell stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair, and hurried from the room. In the dusty storage room on the third floor, behind boxes of financial records and forgotten artwork, he found the music box exactly where he'd left it years ago. His hands shook as he lifted it, noting how the once bright silver had tarnished with age. There on the lid was the pattern Emma had been drawing in the clay, a delicate filigree design that, when looked at carefully, contained small circles crossed with lines. The discovery sent him into a frenzy of research. He spent hours online, searching for anything connected to the symbol, the music box, his father's disappearance. His corporate lawyers called repeatedly, warning him about shareholders' meetings he was missing, contracts requiring his immediate attention. He let their messages pile up, unheard. It was Martha who finally forced him to take a break, bringing him coffee and a simple sandwich late one evening. As he ate mechanically, she spoke the words that had been building behind her concerned expression. "She's starting to trust you," Martha said quietly. "Really trust you, not just depend on you. Do you know what she told me this morning? She said she feels safe when she hears you walking in the hallway at night checking the doors. She said your footsteps sound like protection." The simple statement hit Maxwell with unexpected force. He thought of all the nights he'd paced the halls, plagued by insomnia and worry, not knowing that his restless wandering had been providing comfort to the frightened child down the hall. That night, he heard Emma crying out from another nightmare. When he reached her room, he found her not in her usual closet nest, but sitting on the bed, her small frame rigid with tension. "The lady with quiet shoes," she whispered as he approached. "She had a box like yours, but hers didn't make pretty music. Hers made counting music." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dim light from the hallway. "Your daddy gave you your box to remember him. Her box was to make us forget." Maxwell sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining the distance he knew Emma needed. "Forget what, Emma?" She shook her head, pulling her knees to her chest. "The green door, the big house, the other children." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The man with the ring who wrote in his book." Before Maxwell could respond, a sound from downstairs made them both freeze. The distinct click of the front door latch, followed by the soft tread of footsteps on hardwood floors. Footsteps too quiet to be Martha's. Emma's face went stark, white. "Quiet shoes," she breathed, and began her counting ritual with desperate intensity. Maxwell moved swiftly to the door, his heart pounding. In the hallway below, a shadow moved across the wall, a familiar silhouette that sent him hurtling back through decades of memory. The shape of those shoulders, the slight tilt of the head, the measured pace of each step. He knew those movements. He'd spent years trying to forget them. But before he could process this recognition, Emma's counting stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound he'd never heard from her before, a small, broken whimper that spoke of absolute terror. When he turned, back to her, she was pointing at something on the floor near his feet. There, slipped under the door while his back was turned, was a small silver key attached to a ribbon. A key that would fit perfectly into the music box locked away upstairs, and tied to the ribbon was a note with 3 simple words: "Time to remember." The night of the intruder changed everything. After calling the police, who found no evidence, of forced entry and seemed skeptically amused by a millionaire's paranoia, Maxwell made a decision that surprised even himself. He moved Emma's nest of blankets into his study, setting up a small bed in the corner where she could see both the door and the windows. He spent that night in his armchair, watching her fitful sleep while turning the silver key over and over in his hands. The morning brought more upheaval. The board of directors had called an emergency vote, and Maxwell's control of his own company was now in jeopardy. His largest development project, a luxury apartment complex in downtown Hartford, had lost its funding overnight. Investors were pulling out in droves, and rumors of his mental instability had reached the national business press. But none of that seemed to matter as he watched Emma that morning, methodically arranging her cereal with shaking hands. She hadn't spoken since the footsteps in the hall, but her eyes constantly darted to the windows, checking and rechecking the latches with quiet desperation. Dr. Walsh arrived early, having been called by Martha about the night's events. She found Emma in an unusual state. Instead of her careful counting, the child was drawing frantically, paper after paper filled with the same scene: a large house with many windows, a green door, and figures wearing what looked like matching dresses. "Emma," Dr. Walsh said gently, "can you tell me about this house?" Emma's crayon moved faster, adding dark clouds above the building. "The counting house," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "where the quiet shoes lady teaches numbers, where the man with the ring watches and writes." Her hand trembled as she drew another figure near the green door, "where they make you forget your name." Maxwell, standing in the doorway, felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered something his father used to say: "Numbers don't lie, son. People lie, feelings lie, but numbers always tell the truth." He'd built his entire business empire on that philosophy, turning emotions into calculations, relationships into transactions. Dr. Walsh noticed his reaction. "Maxwell, what are you thinking about?" Before he could answer, Emma spoke again, her voice taking on that distant quality they'd come to associate with her. Deepest memories. "The man with the ring said that too. When we got the counting wrong, he said numbers don't lie." The room seemed to tilt beneath Maxwell's feet. He steadied himself against the doorframe, memories flooding back. His father's obsession with precision, the endless drilling in mathematics, the punishment for incorrect calculations, the way he would tap his signet ring against his notebook while watching, always watching. Martha's voice from the hallway broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Harrison, there's someone here from the bank. They're saying there are irregularities with your accounts. Large withdrawals from years ago that don't match their records." Emma's crayon snapped in her hand. She looked up at Maxwell with eyes that held too much understanding for a child her age. "The book," she said. "The man with the ring wrote everything in his book. All the numbers, all the children." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Emma, how many children were in the counting house?" 7 times 7, Emma replied automatically, then flinched as if expecting punishment. "No, 6 times 7 now, after Sarah got the counting wrong." Maxwell felt the blood drain from his face. Sarah. The name triggered another memory, a small article he'd dismissed years ago about a missing girl named Sarah Chen, the same surname as the social worker who had first visited them. The same social worker who had seemed so intent on removing Emma from his care. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check the music box. Some songs need to be heard." With trembling hands, Maxwell retrieved the box from its hiding place. Emma watched from her corner, her small body tense but her eyes clear and focused. Dr. Walsh observed silently as he inserted the silver key. The lid opened with a soft click, but no music played. Instead, hidden in a secret compartment beneath the dancing figure, Maxwell found a small notebook. His father's notebook filled with columns of numbers and dates and names, so many names. As he flipped through the pages, dates jumped out at him, transactions, properties, and something else, something that made his stomach turn. Each name was followed by a series of numbers, age, height, weight, and a dollar amount. Emma's voice cut through the silence. "The book tells who we are, where we came from, what we're worth." She touched her chest where a dress had once borne the circle and line symbol. "The counting dress shows we belong to them." The implications of her words, combined with the evidence in his hands, sent Maxwell running to the bathroom, barely making it in time to be violently ill. His father hadn't just abandoned him that day at the bus station. He'd been testing him, evaluating him, and when Maxwell had failed whatever test was being administered, he'd been spared the fate of children like Emma. When he returned to the study, Dr. Walsh was on the phone, her voice tight with controlled fury as she spoke to someone in authority. Emma had retreated to her corner, but her eyes held something new, not just fear, but determination. "They're coming," she said simply. The quiet shoes lady always knows when someone finds the book. As if in confirmation, Martha appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Mr. Harrison, there are people at the gate. Ms. Chen from Social Services, and she's not alone." The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway, followed by footsteps on gravel. Emma began her counting, but this time it sounded different. Not fearful, but measured, purposeful. She was counting the seconds they had left before their worlds collided completely. The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Sarah Chen stood in Maxwell's study, her professional demeanor unchanged, but something cold and calculating had crept into her eyes. Behind her, two men in suits waited silently by the door, their presence more threatening for its stillness. "We're here for the child," Sarah announced, her voice carrying that same quiet authority that had once made Emma tremble. "And the box." Maxwell stood between them and Emma's corner, his father's notebook clutched in his hand. Dr. Walsh remained, seated near Emma, her phone discreetly recording everything. Martha hovered in the doorway, her aged hands gripping the frame with white-knuckled tension. "She's not going anywhere," Maxwell said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice, "and neither is the evidence of what you people have been doing." Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Evidence? A disturbed child's fantasies and an old man's accounting ledger? Who do you think will believe you, Mr. Harrison? The businessman having a mental breakdown, losing his company, obsessing over a runaway he illegally harbored?" "I'll believe him, Doctor," Walsh spoke up, rising from her chair. "And so will my colleagues at the Child Trauma Research Center. We've documented everything." One of the men by the door shifted slightly, his hand moving toward his jacket. Sarah shot him a warning glance. "Dr. Walsh, your involvement here is appreciated, but no longer required. This is now a matter for social services." "Is that what you told Sarah Chen's parents?" Maxwell asked quietly. "Your own brother and sister-in-law when their daughter disappeared. Was that a matter for social services too?" The change in Sarah's expression was subtle but unmistakable, flicker of something dark and wounded beneath her professional mask. "You have no idea what you're talking about." 7 times 7, Emma's voice came from her corner, clear and steady. "That's how many we were. Then 6 times 7 after Sarah got the counting wrong." She stood slowly, her small frame straight and unbending. "You watched her count. You watched her get it wrong. You wore the quiet shoes and smiled." Sarah's composure cracked just for a moment. She was weak. They all were. The numbers don't lie. Only the strong deserve to survive. That's what he taught us. "Who taught you, Sarah?" Maxwell pressed, though he already knew the answer. "The man with the ring, the one who wrote in this book about buying and selling children like they were properties." A sound from outside drew everyone's attention, police sirens growing closer. Dr. Walsh's hand moved away from her phone, and a small smile touched her lips. Sarah's eyes widened in genuine fear for the first time. "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice losing its professional edge. "He saved us. He saw our potential when no one else did. The weak ones, the ones who couldn't learn the system, they had to be removed. It was mercy." "Mercy?" Maxwell's voice shook with rage. "You call traumatizing children mercy? Teaching them to count their own worth in dollars? Making them wear those dresses with your sick symbol?" "The symbol means chosen," Sarah snapped, her calm facade crumbling completely. "Like you were supposed to be before you failed the test at the bus station. Your father was so disappointed." The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. "My father, he was part of this all along. He created this." Sarah's laugh held an edge of hysteria. The perfect system to separate the worthy from the weak. And when his own son proved unworthy, he dedicated his life to finding better candidates. The police sirens were very close now. The two men by the door exchanged nervous glances, but Sarah seemed beyond caring. She turned to Emma, her voice taking on an almost pleading quality. "You were one of the best, Emma. Your counting was perfect. Your memory, your focus, you could have been exceptional. Why did you run?" Emma's answer was quiet but clear. "Because numbers do lie. They lie when you make them mean more than people." The sound of car doors slamming came from the driveway, followed by authoritative voices and heavy footsteps. Sarah's associates moved toward the door, but she remained, still, staring at Emma with an expression of mingled fury and despair. "You'll never prove any of this," she said, but her voice held more desperation than conviction. "The system is too big, too well protected. He made sure of that." "Maybe," Maxwell replied, moving to stand beside Emma, "but we can prove enough. Starting with your involvement, and this book of transactions, every name, every date, every dollar amount, including what happened to your niece." Sarah's face went ash white. Behind her, uniformed officers appeared in the doorway, led by a detective holding a warrant. Dr. Walsh stood calmly, her phone still recording, as she began explaining the situation to the authorities. Emma's small hand found Maxwell's, her fingers intertwining with his. She wasn't counting anymore. Instead, she watched with clear, steady eyes as Sarah Chen was led away, her quiet shoes making no sound on the hardwood floors. What none of them realized yet was that this was only the beginning. The notebook in Maxwell's hand would unlock doors they never knew existed, revealing a network that spread far beyond one man's twisted vision of worth and worthiness. But, for now in that moment, something profound had shifted in both Maxwell and Emma's worlds, the first crack in a wall of fear that had contained them both for so long. The aftermath of Sarah Chen's arrest brought chaos of a different kind. Reporters camped outside the estate's gates, their cameras flashing every time a police car or official vehicle passed through. Maxwell's name was splashed across headlines, nationwide, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected months ago. The notebook had opened a floodgate. Detectives worked around the clock, cross-referencing dates and names, uncovering a network that had operated in plain sight for decades. More survivors came forward, each carrying their own stories of counting, quiet shoes, and green doors. Emma watched it all with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension, her counting rituals now interspersed with long periods of thoughtful silence. Maxwell's business empire continued to crumble, but he hardly noticed. Board meetings and investor calls went unattended as he devoted himself to working with investigators, supporting Emma through her increasingly revealing therapy sessions, and confronting his own long-buried trauma. "Your father's system was extensive," Detective Roberts explained one evening, spreading photographs across Maxwell's study desk. He used his real estate holdings as cover, moving children through properties across multiple states. The music boxes were his signature, a way to condition the children using sound association. Maxwell stared at the images, more silver music boxes, each identical to his own, each containing hidden compartments for documents and money. And Sarah? How did she become involved? "She was one of the first," Roberts said quietly. "Chosen, at the same age you were when your father left you at that bus station. But unlike you, she passed his test. She became his protégé, eventually placing her own niece into the system to prove her loyalty." Emma, who had taken to sitting in on these discussions from her corner, spoke up unexpectedly. She counted wrong on purpose. Both men turned to look at her. She sat cross-legged on her blanket, absently stroking Winston's head. The dog had become her constant companion since the arrest. "Sarah's niece," Emma continued, her voice distant but clear. "She counted wrong to make it stop. Like the others wanted to, but were too scared." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Maxwell felt a familiar ache in his chest as he thought of all the children who had faced his father's tests, who had been forced to prove their worth through his twisted arithmetic. Dr. Walsh's daily sessions took on new urgency as Emma began to share more details. The counting house had been one of many properties, each designed to look normal from the outside. Children were moved between locations regularly, their worth determined by their ability to maintain perfect count despite the constant changes. It wasn't just about the numbers, Emma explained during one session, her hands busy with the clay she had come to find comforting. It was about being perfect, never crying, never asking questions, never making mistakes. The quiet shoes, lady, Ms. Sarah, said we were being trained for important things. Maxwell's own memories began to surface with crushing clarity. The endless mathematics drills, the punishments for incorrect answers, his father's constant reinforcement that emotion was weakness and precision was power. He had escaped that fate only by failing, by showing the very human frailty his father despised. The media frenzy intensified as more details emerged. Maxwell's remaining business partners fled, his stock prices plummeted, and his carefully constructed reputation lay in ruins. But somehow none of it seemed to matter anymore. His focus had narrowed to one singular purpose, ensuring Emma's safety and recovery. Martha remained their constant support, defending their privacy from reporters, maintaining the household's routine, and providing a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. She had become particularly protective of Emma, whose nightmares had evolved from terrified counting to confusion about her future. "What happens when the numbers stop?" Emma asked one night, after waking from a particularly vivid dream. She sat in the kitchen with Maxwell and Martha, clutching a mug of warm milk. "Who am I without the counting?" Maxwell, who had been asking himself similar questions about his own identity without his business empire, found himself sharing a look of understanding with the child. "We'll find out together," he said softly. "One day at a time." But life had other plans. One morning, Maxwell received a call that would force them to confront their greatest fears. Sarah Chen had agreed to a plea deal in exchange for information that included the current location of Maxwell's father and the full extent of his operation. The news sent Emma into a panic unlike anything they'd seen since her arrival. She retreated to her closet nest, counting frantically in multiple languages, her small body shaking with terror. When Maxwell finally coaxed her out, her words chilled him to the bone. "He'll come back," she whispered, clinging to his sleeve. "The man with the ring always comes back for the ones who run. He says numbers don't lie, and his numbers say we belong to him." Maxwell held her trembling form, his own fear mixing with a fierce determination. He had failed to stand up to his father once before, had spent decades running from that memory. He wouldn't fail again, not when Emma's future hung in the balance. What he didn't know was that his father had already set events in motion that would force both Maxwell and Emma to face their deepest fears, leading to a confrontation that would either break them completely or finally set them free from the prison of perfect numbers and quiet shoes. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Maxwell's father had been located at one of his old properties, a sprawling estate in upstate New York that had been hiding in plain sight under a series of shell companies. The investigators wanted Maxwell to identify him, to confirm that Harrison Sr. was indeed the architect of the counting system that had destroyed so many lives. Emma sensed the change in Maxwell before he even told her. She found him in his study, staring at an old photograph, his hands shaking slightly. Without a word, she sat in her usual corner and began to count, not from fear this time, but as if preparing herself for battle. "He wants to see you," Maxwell said finally, his voice rough. "Both of us." Emma's counting paused briefly before resuming at a slower pace. 7 steps to the door, she said quietly, 12 to the window, 4 to safety. She looked up at Maxwell with eyes that held decades of wisdom in their depths. "But safety isn't in the counting anymore, is it?" Maxwell shook his head, moving to kneel beside her. "No, it's not. Safety is in here." He touched his heart, then hers, a gesture that would have been impossible months ago. "In being imperfect, in being human." Dr. Walsh strongly advised against the meeting, but Emma surprised them all by insisting on going. "The numbers don't own us," she said during her therapy session, her voice stronger than they'd ever heard it. "I want him to see that." The drive to New York was quiet, broken only by Emma's occasional counting, a habit they now understood might never fully disappear, but one that was slowly transforming from a prison into simply another way she experienced the world. Maxwell held the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, his mind racing through years of memories. The estate was exactly as Emma had drawn it in her countless pictures, imposing windows, manicured lawns, and that infamous green door. Federal agents met them in the driveway, explaining the security procedures and what to expect. Maxwell barely heard them. His attention was fixed on Emma, who stood perfectly still, staring at the house with an expression of calm determination. That made his heart ache with pride. Harrison Sr. waited in what had once been his study. Age had turned his hair white, but his posture remained rigid, his signet ring gleaming as he tapped it against the arm of his chair. When Maxwell and Emma entered, his expression registered nothing, no shame, no remorse, not even surprise. "You failed the test," he said to Maxwell, his voice exactly as it had been that day at the bus station. "But you still managed to find one of my prize pupils." He turned his cold gaze to Emma. "Number 7, your counting was exceptional." Emma didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her small hand finding Maxwell's. "My name is Emma," she said clearly. "Numbers lie when you use them to hurt people." The old man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Numbers are the only truth in a world of chaos. I gave you order. I gave you purpose, both of you." He looked at Maxwell. "Everything you built, every success you achieved, came from what I taught you about the purity of mathematics." "No," Maxwell replied, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "Everything I built came from trying to prove my worth. To a father who saw children as commodities, I became exactly what you wanted, cold, calculating, alone, until Emma showed me what real strength looks like." Emma squeezed his hand and began to count out loud. 1 smile, 2 friends, 3 people who love me now. She met Harrison Sr.'s gaze without fear. "Your numbers taught us to be afraid. Our numbers teach us to be free." The old man's composure cracked slightly. "Sentiment," he spat, "weakness. Everything I built, every child I refined, every system I perfected, all designed to eliminate such human frailty." "And that's why you failed," Maxwell said softly, "because it's our human frailty that makes us strong. Emma taught me that. A child you tried to break showed me how to be whole again." Harrison Sr.'s hand tightened on his ring, but before he could respond, Emma stepped forward again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, the silver key to Maxwell's music box. "Your numbers don't count anymore," she said, placing the key on the desk. "We make our own music now." The symbolism of the gesture seemed to age Harrison Sr. by decades. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he looked between his son and the child who had defied his perfect system. The federal agents chose that moment to enter, ready to process him for formal charging. As they led him away, he turned back one last time. "The system was perfect," he insisted, but his voice had lost its authority. "The numbers don't lie." "No," Emma said softly, "but they don't tell the whole truth either. The truth is in here." She touched her heart, then reached for Maxwell's hand again. "In the things you can't count." They stood together, watching as Harrison Sr. was escorted out of the house that had hidden so many dark secrets. Emma's counting had stopped completely, replaced by a quiet humming. Not the mechanical melody of the music box, but a simple, imperfect tune of her own making. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds. Maxwell and Emma walked back to their car, past the green door that no longer held any power over them. The federal agents would spend weeks documenting evidence, tracking down other survivors, dismantling the network that had destroyed so many lives. But for Maxwell and Emma, the real work of healing was just beginning. A journey that would require no counting, no tests, no perfect numbers. Spring bloomed in Connecticut, bringing with it winds of change. Maxwell's once vast business empire had contracted to a handful of legitimate properties. His fortune diminished, but not destroyed. The mansion, with its imposing gates and manicured lawns, had been sold, partly to pay legal fees, partly because neither he nor Emma could sleep peacefully in its echoing halls anymore. They moved to a modest house on the outskirts of town, a simple two-story home with a wraparound porch and a backyard where Winston and Churchill could run freely. Martha came with them, refusing to retire despite Maxwell's insistence that she had earned her rest. "Family doesn't retire," she said firmly, as she arranged their new kitchen to Emma's specifications. Everything visible, everything in its place, but now more from choice than fear. The media circus eventually died down as bigger stories took precedence. Harrison Sr.'s trial proceeded quietly, with Emma's testimony being given via closed-circuit television to protect her privacy. Other survivors came forward, each sharing their own stories of the counting houses and quiet shoes. A support network formed, healing spreading like ripples in still water. Dr. Walsh continued her sessions with Emma, now conducted in their sunny new living room. The changes in the child were subtle but profound. She still counted, but differently, now counting birds at the feeder, flowers in the garden, stars visible from her bedroom window. The numbers had become tools for understanding her world rather than imprisoning her within it. "The counting used to be about being perfect," she explained to Maxwell one evening as they planted a small vegetable garden. "Now it's about being real." She held up a handful of seeds. "These don't grow in perfect rows, they grow where they need to be." Maxwell's own therapy had revealed layers of trauma he'd never acknowledged: his obsession with control, his isolation, his inability to form meaningful connections, all stemmed from that day at the bus station and the years of conditioning that preceded it. But like Emma, he was learning to reshape his relationship with numbers and worth. The business world hadn't forgotten him entirely. Occasionally, offers would come in, opportunities to rebuild his empire, to reclaim his former status. He declined them all, focusing instead on using his remaining resources to establish a foundation supporting children who had survived trauma. The irony of his father's fortune being used to heal the damage he had caused was not lost on anyone. Emma's recovery was not a straight line. There were still nights when the nightmares came, when the counting became frantic and fearful. But now she would seek comfort instead of hiding, would allow herself to be held until the terror passed. She began to attend a small private school, working with teachers who understood her unique needs and celebrated her progress rather than her perfection. One particularly significant moment came when Emma discovered art class. Her precise counting translated into an unexpected talent for patterns and design. She began creating intricate mandalas, each one containing hidden numbers that told stories of healing rather than hurt. Her art therapist recognized these works as a form of reclaiming her experience, transforming the rigid mathematics of her past into something beautiful and free. Maxwell found his own way of reconciling with numbers through the Foundation's work. Instead of using figures to measure worth, he used them to track progress. How many children helped? How many families supported? How many lives touched by their programs? The cold precision of his business years gave way to a warmer, more human understanding of success. Martha watched these transformations with quiet satisfaction, maintaining their daily routines while gently encouraging new experiences. She taught Emma to bake, showing her how recipes were really just numbers in disguise, but numbers that created comfort and joy rather than fear and control. The doghouse from the mansion, that crucial piece of their shared history, found a new home in their backyard. Emma had asked to keep it, not from any lingering trauma, but as a reminder of where their journey together had begun. Maxwell had it restored and repainted, and now it stood as a playhouse where Emma and her new school friends would spend hours sharing secrets and dreams. As summer approached, their little family settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Emma's counting became more sporadic, usually appearing now only when she was deeply focused on a task or processing something new. The quiet shoes and green doors featured less frequently in her artwork, replaced by butterflies, sunshine, and the occasional portrait of Winston and Churchill napping on the porch. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset, Emma leaned against Maxwell's shoulder and said something that made his heart swell with emotion. "I counted all the good things that happened since I found you. The number keeps getting bigger every day. Maxwell wrapped his arm around her small shoulders, marveling at how far they had both come from the broken souls they'd been that cold morning in January. They were not perfect, would never be perfect, and that was precisely what made them whole. What neither of them realized yet was that their story would inspire others to seek help, to question systems that valued perfection over humanity, to believe in the possibility of healing. But that understanding would come later. For now they simply sat together, counting stars as they appeared,